But for now, let me introduce Steve. Our first speaker is Steve Midgely. I had the privilege of being taught by him as part of my Cambridge Theological Federation course earlier this year, and is an excellent teacher. You're going to enjoy this session. His background is as a psychiatrist before he was ordained, and then the leader of Christchurch, minister of Christchurch, Cambridge, for a number of years. He has also been involved in setting up biblical counseling in the UK, which I know is the reason why some of you are here through their network. And he's taught courses in biblical counseling at Oak Hill Theological College and published a number of books, including the one I just mentioned. So over to you, Steve.
Very good. Okay. So, as I said, lots to get through in a short space of time, and a lot less than it. I said that I wanted to speak about theory, but before I think about theory, I would like to begin with people, because that's what we're thinking about today. It's people that we care about, and it's people that are affected and endure and struggle with, and we try to love with their mental health problems. So here are three people from my past. Susie was a woman that I met as when I was working as a psychiatrist. She was an inpatient on the ward when I began a 6-month stint in an inpatient unit. She was still there when I left 6 months later. Because this is back in the late 80s, when people with eating disorders, which is what Susie had, were often managed with very long periods of inpatient care. And Susie and I used to speak a couple of times a week over that 6-month period. And much of what I understand and learned about the experience of anorexia nervosa comes from her. And one thing stands out, which is the time that she talked to me about something that happened when she went on a home visit, which she would often do during weekends. And she told me that on this particular home visit, she had gone to a public toilet and she had drunk from the water in the toilet pan in order to use that water to make herself sick, vomit up the small amount of food that she'd taken that day. And I remember her saying to me that the reason that she had done that is because somehow that disgusting act somehow conveyed the sense of disgust she felt for herself. Jim he was a man that I met working as a pastor. He was a new dad. But instead of being a delighted and thrilled father of his new baby daughter, he lived with dread and terror. And his dread and terror was that he would abuse his daughter. He didn't want to abuse his daughter, but the thought that he might kept popping into his head. And every day was ruined by this sense of terror that he might abuse his own daughter. The possibility of changing a nappy was completely out of the question. That triggered these kind of thoughts too intensely. He'd stopped at any time being alone with his baby daughter. And just the other day, his wife needed to rush out of the room, pop their baby daughter on his lap, and he just jumped up in terror because of the thoughts that drove into his head. David, who I also met in my work as a pastor, was depressed. He made some mistakes at work. As a result of those errors, people had lost their jobs, the company had lost a vast amount of money, and he plunged into depression. It was intense, and he was despairing. But he was also deceived. The company hadn't lost lots of money, and lots of people hadn't been made redundant. Those imaginations of what had taken place were a feature of the depth of depression and the distorted thinking that spilled out of it. What the Susie and Jim and David tell us that they just give us a little bit of insight into the great pain that so much mental health disorders and struggling create for people. Enormous pain. We also see, and we'll look at some statistics later on, that these struggles, but these struggles are also very common. We'll look at statistics in a bit. But I begin with people because I recognise this is personal to all of us. Either we ourselves have been affected by our own mental health struggles, or somebody close to us in their families would have done. And while Helen and I will do our best as we work through this material to be sensitive to that, please forgive if you're trying to get through things quickly. I say anything that's clumsy. I'll try my best not to. Forgive me if I do. We'll begin with a question, in a sense. What's the title of this day? Mental Health Challenges, a Christian Response. What a Christian response? Seems to me that that's a question worth asking. Is this really any of our business? There's an argument, isn't there, to say that actually this should be left to the mental health professionals. What persuades the Faraday Institute to run a day on mental health? I'm guessing they aren't planning to run a day on a Christian response to gastrointestinal disorders. But you could argue that if they did chose to do so, they would have more biblical justification for doing that. At least we have a verse with instructions about our guts. Paul has advice for Timothy to look after his gastrointestinal tract. Where are the verses about schizoaffective disorder, or OCD, or bulimia? We'll search in vain to find anything in Scripture about those. So, this raises questions about what we really believe about mental health disorders in the first place. See, if I put this question in front of you, if I asked you what your instinctive reaction to those two statements is, as you think about Susie with her anorexia, or Jim with his OCD, David with his depression, which of these two statements sounds more obviously true? That mental illness is a spiritual issue and the solution is repentance and faith, or that mental illness is a biological and brain issue and the solution is medication. I'm guessing that instinctively, before we start to sort of tease apart our response in slightly more detail, we tend to pull over to the right-hand side. Certainly our culture and the mental health world as it operates at the moment would pull us very much to the right-hand side of that sort of forced choice. So I've got three aims really. The first is to establish a connection, to, as it were, say, on what basis do we think that it's appropriate to make a Christian response in terms of not just caring, as we would for anyone who is suffering or struggling, but more of a Christian response in terms of thinking, what are causes here, and how could the Christian faith speak into these struggles? And then to explore a model that I find helpful in my own thinking and response in this area. And then a little bit, quickly at the end, to speak about the crisis that is often identified in relation to mental health struggles at the moment. So, first up, let's think a little bit about what we mean by mental health struggles in the first place. The World Health Organization defines mental health in this way. Mental health is a state of mental well-being that enables people to cope with the stresses of life, realise their abilities, learn well, work well, and contribute to their community. Clearly, a positive definition, very ambitious definition as well. If I asked any of us in the room whether we feel that at this point we are at peak contribution, realising all our abilities, learning well and working well, I guess most of us would say, well, we're not peak. we're somewhere okay. But are any of us on this definition fully mentally healthy? But of course, you also notice that the way in which the language of mental health is being used has got quite interesting. The language is sort of drifted in all sorts of ways. I read an article in the New York Times recently in which a psychologist described receiving a letter referring a man to him, a man who had significant depression, had recently made a serious suicide attempt, and the letter from the referring clinician referred to this man's past, because he had a number of episodes of depression in the past. And the clinician's referring letter said, this man has a history of mental health. Because we have got sort of slightly sort of clumsy about the way that we use mental health. I've got some mental health meaning, I've got some mental health struggles, I've got some difficulties. And that shift of language has gone hand in hand with a very significant broadening of the category. So that instead of only referring to the more significant, serious mental health struggles like psychotic illness, the language of mental health struggles is getting used for things that feel much more like normal life. So that what might have previously just been described as someone who is very shy could now be identified as social anxiety disorder. The person who has clearly got a very short temper, which can flare up dramatically, can be recast as intermittent explosive disorder. Even some of the experimental categories within DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, that is the definition of psychiatric diagnosis that is used particularly in the States. There are exploratory diagnoses that include caffeine use disorder, internet gaming disorder. Now, my point is not to mock any of those struggles. Those are real struggles with real difficulties. My concern is to ask whether it is helping us or hindering us to take those difficulties and cast them in the realm of psychiatric illness and disease. I'm not the only person who has some hesitations about that. Alan Francis was a psychiatrist who was the chair of the committee that put into place DSM-4 rediscussion. He had this to say about DSM-5, the version that came after him. Many millions of people with normal grief, gluttony, distractibility, worries, reactions to stress, the temper tantrum of childhood, the forgetting of old age, and behavioural addictions will soon be mislabelled as psychiatrically sick. There are worries within the mental health world about this medicalisation of normal life, as it's being described. One writer who has explored that in considerable detail is a man called Richard Hallam. He's a psychologist. He's written a book called Abolishing the Concept of Mental Illness. I'm not necessarily saying I go along with all of his analysis, but I think he has some interesting things to say. He wants to recapture the idea of our woes, and he uses the word deliberately to normalise, to say life is hard, life has woes. Here's what he comments. For a person who suffers from or has to endure a woe, a label of mental illness can be confusing. Their woe has become an id, an object that must be passively accepted, rather than understood and confronted as something that can be changed. I think his insights and his challenges there are really valuable. And I think there are right concerns about this broadening of the category of mental illness. Now, maybe you're thinking, really? Aren't you pushing that a bit far? Surely at the end of the day, a mental illness is a mental illness, because a doctor diagnoses it. Well, it's not quite that easy. A medical illness, like diabetes or like renal failure, isn't really quite the same as a diagnosis within the psychiatric realm. You see, psychiatric diagnoses are different. When a doctor diagnoses a physical illness, almost always there is some sort of biological marker to confirm the diagnosis that's being made. The doctor may have a blood test, a biopsy result, a CT scan. Psychiatrists almost never have that. So when a psychiatrist is making a diagnosis, they are doing so on the basis of, first, the experiences the person describes, and second, the observations that the psychiatrist is making. In that sense, then, a psychiatric diagnosis is much more like a description than it is an explanation. The other key observation I want to make in this area is that it's also very unclear where normal ends and abnormal begins, where normality and illness are to be separated. Take spiders. What do you do when you find a spider in the bath? I'm guessing that we vary. It may be that you see the spider in the bath and you pick it up and you pop it out of the window. Or it may be that you think, I'll get a little bit of toilet paper and then I'll pick it up and pop it out of the bath. Or it may be you play the sort of the cup and card trick and you pop the cup over the spider, then you shuffle the card underneath and then you carry the said spider to the window and pop it out. Maybe even that is a little bit too sensitive for you. And so your approach to the spider in the bath is to say, help, there's a spider in the bath, could somebody come and sort the spider out, please? Because you'd rather have somebody else deal with the said spider. But maybe you get to thinking that spiders come out of that little draining plug thing, don't they, in baths? That's where they come from. And if that's true, then that could happen when you're in the bath. That's scary. So actually, maybe best not have baths. I just have showers. But then you think, well, if they can come out the draining thing there, then they could probably come up the draining thing in my shower. That's scary. I think I won't have a shower. I just wash with a plastic bowl. But it's not only showers and baths when spiders appear. They can appear anywhere. They come from cracks around a skirting board. So you get some polyfill and you fill up all of the cracks in your skirting board. And you think that might not be any place they come from. They could appear at any time. So you start wearing marigold washing up gloves all day, every day, just in case a spider should take you by surprise. Every one of us online and in the room is somewhere on the spectrum that I've just described. Where is the dividing line at which we say somebody has got spider phobia? The technical definitions will describe the point at which it begins to make a serious and significant impact on your life. But you can see that that's a fairly arbitrary thing. And that particular fear exists on the spectrum that I've just described. As does so many of the difficulties and struggles that we're talking about. It's not a simple and clear and straightforward thing to identify the presence or absence of a psychiatric disorder, a mental health problem. And that's why, when we come back to our original question, do we have any basis for taking a specifically Christian approach to the issue of mental health? the answer has to be yes. Because we are working in the same territory. When, as Christian pastors or leaders, or indeed just as a Christian trying to love our friends, as we try to bring truth about God to bear upon another person's life, we are working in the same territory of trying to help people with ordinary struggles somewhere on that spectrum. See, if you think about the scientific discipline of psychology, at root, psychology is just trying to understand people, what they do and why. And the psychotherapies that spill out of psychological understanding are trying to fix people, trying to offer a therapy using the mind in one way or another that helps people to overcome struggles that they're facing in life. But you see, you can't fix people, you can't help people to live life well without asking and answering some pretty fundamental questions about people. Like, what is a person? And when things go wrong for us in life, what is it that goes wrong with us? Because what we think goes wrong with us will determine what we think will help put us right. See, if your concept of a person is that they are a complex animal, as behavioural psychologists would use that as their model, then you would apply learning behaviour, much as you would use learning and training an animal. So we try and apply that kind of thinking to the way that we try and help somebody using behavioural psychological techniques. If, on the other hand, you think that people are individuals who are wrestling with the reality of their ultimate meaninglessness in a universe that has no purpose, no meaning, no significance, and nothing after death, then you might not engage in existential psychotherapy, which is helping people to come to terms with that reality, the emptiness of life, the reality of death, the inability to be able to connect with any other person truly, because you don't know anyone else really, or all of some of the tenets of existential psychotherapy. The framework that you have in your understanding, your psychology, determines the type of psychotherapeutic input you can give. And what is right anyway? What is the goal of life? Clearly, if you're going to try and offer someone a therapy that is going to help them to live life well, then you have to answer the question, what is the good life? What is the life worth living? Are we calling people to pursue happiness, or usefulness, or material gain? Clearly, you need to be able to answer that question before you offer a therapy to try and help people make progress. So as soon as you move into the territory of mental health and mental illness, it's not going to be long before these kind of questions arise, at least if you're going to be honest and truthful about the nature of the endeavour that you're engaging with. And the best psychiatrists know that. Look at this comment from a former director of the National Institute of Mental Health in America. He has this to say: these psychiatrists have been given an impossible task, and medications are sometimes able to alleviate symptoms, and they often come with side effects. But we cannot give people what they really need. People need meaning and relationship. It's a very honest and very humble comment from a man at the very forefront of his academic discipline. I've made this point because I want to persuade us that this is legitimate territory for us to be involved in not just in the sort of raw care and about someone suffering, but actually to speak more specifically and more theologically into this space. I'm going to do this ridiculously simple, far too quickly, but just think about some typical struggles in this area. Think about the experience of depression, where a sense of despair and hopelessness is so often prominent. Well, you don't need me to tell you that the Christian faith has a huge amount to say about hope, which has to be relevant to that experience of hopelessness. Or think about all of the anxiety disorders. We may not have mentioned obsessive compulsive disorder anywhere in Scripture, but issues of fear are everywhere. And it may not be a simple thing to work out what it means to bring the Bible's teaching about the experience of fear, and indeed fear of the Lord, to bear upon the experience of somebody with an obsessive compulsive disorder or a generalised anxiety disorder. But there will be a way, and there will be relevance. But we'll think about post-traumatic stress disorder, where issues of safety are so prominent. Well, again, refuge in the Lord and a sense of security in Him is a huge Bible theme. Please don't imagine that I am suggesting to you that sort of taking the verse about God being a refuge and strength and sort of throwing it at a person like a hand grenade is what I'm suggesting. That's not what clearly the way in which we bring theological truth and biblical insight into the life of somebody who's struggling is a complex thing. But that there will be ways of doing so, and that we should find ways of doing so, is all that I'm trying to emphasise at this point. Even when we come to addictions, we were thinking about this afternoon, many people who struggle with addictions of whatever sort will speak of their sense of powerlessness in the face of their addictive patterns and behaviour. And again, even if the link isn't simple and straightforward, the Bible's notion of slavery to sin, of this sense of feeling trapped and not having the resources to be able to resist our own desires, surely has something to say to the experience of addiction. Again, how we live it is important. Okay, so in this first section, I just wanted to persuade you of the connections, that this is legitimate territory for us to be thinking about. Let me, it's very dull listening to me for a long period of time, I get bored, and you probably do too. Why not just talk to somebody next to you for a moment, just to break things up a little bit. Are you persuaded by what I've said? Are you persuaded of the essential connections with mental health struggles and the Christian faith, God's place in our world? And what questions does this raise for you? If I get my times right, I probably won't, but if I do get my times right, then there'll be a little bit of time for some to and fro at the end. If you have questions, you can go for them. So just take 3 or 4 minutes to chat together. People on Zoom and pop into groups as well. So if you've not met the person you're sitting next to, now would be an excellent moment to introduce yourself, find out who they are, and have a little natter about what you feel so far. So far, I've wanted to persuade you of a connection. And the second thing I want to do is to say, well, if there is a connection, then what framework will help us to engage appropriately and thoughtfully? And I want to put in front of you a model. It's not mine. It's borrowed, stolen, like just about everything that I do. long since decided that mine is a ministry of plagiarism. And this is a borrowed model that I find very helpful, and it will often be in my head when I'm thinking about and engaging with individuals. So here's how it goes. It is, I suppose, in a sense, almost like a sort of a biblical anthropology. It's trying to say, how does the Bible describe people? And the first thing to say is that in biblical thinking, the word that is most often used to describe the very essence of the person is the heart. Many words used in Scripture to describe the sort of the inner person, mind, soul, spirit, are also used, but probably heart is the most common. And the heart is kind of the real me, the part of me that takes decisions and sets priorities. The heart is the bit of me that, in Bible thinking, does relationships. It's with my heart that I love, and my heart that I fear. With our hearts, we choose this over that. With our hearts, we forge allegiances and make commitments. The Bible speaks about that which the heart desires. And it therefore follows that it is with our hearts that we worship. With our hearts that we say, this is what I live for. Then the Bible would also be clear that as well as that inner person, there is an outer person, a physical frame. We are embodied souls. Referring to the aging process, Paul says we don't use heart, though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. The Bible thinks in that sort of bipartite way about people. That we have an inner self, the heart, and an outer self, the body. And everything we do is physical. We see with physical eyes. You are currently looking at a PowerPoint or looking at your notes, and light rays are impacting your retinas in a physical way. I am making sound waves that are bouncing onto your tiny little bones in your inner ear, enabling you to hear. The thoughts that you're having at the moment have a physical manifestation in terms of the firing of neurons in your brains. Everything that we do has a physicality to it. That's the way that God has made us. We can't do anything without it being embodied in that sense. So an inner person, an outer person, and also circumstances, a particular context in which we exist. We are in that sense embedded. Embedded is a slightly funny word, but use another E to go alongside embodied. People like me like alliteration, so that's why it's there. You and I live in this particular era of history. You have a particular home, a particular family background. You have a particular job or a particular experience of no job at the moment. We each have our own unique set of circumstances. We are located geographically and relationally. Take somebody who's depressed. I mean, there may be changes going on in their bodies. Perhaps they are physically unwell. Perhaps they have an underactive thyroid gland. That can be a biological basis for the development of low mood. Perhaps they're taking some medication that also has a depressing effect on their mood. Some medication people take for high blood pressure can do that. Or travelling the opposite direction. Perhaps it is their mood that is affecting their body. Start, rather than go from the body to the heart, go from the heart to the body. Because that direction of travel can also be a reality. But as we think about a person, and if you, it's probably too subtle to notice, but I changed this diagram a year or so ago to make it a dotted line around the heart instead of a firm line, to try and emphasise that interplay between heart and body, to emphasise the travel that goes on between those two. Because in a sense we are a person. The Bible's division between inner person and outer person helps us to think, and it's a useful category, but at the end of the day, we are people. We haven't got two bits to us, really. You are a person. And the Bible just uses this language to help us to think. All of these aspects matter. The person who's depressed may have circumstances in their life, either past or present, that are hugely significant in the development of their depression. Awful things that may have happened in the past, awful things that may be happening in the present. But we also have an active heart that is responding to those circumstances, that is taking choices. We are, in that sense, moral agents. Take a different example. Think about Susie with her experience of anorexia. Again, each of these elements are significant. Susie grew up in a Western culture which puts before women a particular physical shape that is to be desired, according to our culture. She lived with that experience. Did that have an impact on the development of her anorexia? Almost certainly. But perhaps she also lived in a family that had incredibly high expectations, standards of perfectionism that were pressed upon her from an early age. Does that seem also to be influential in young women, particularly, who develop anorexia? Again, it seems that it does. But when I met Susie, her body was also having a huge impact on her. She was starving because she was so profoundly underweight. And a starving body does extraordinary things to us. Mood is depressed, concentration is difficult because the body is preoccupied with its need for sustenance. But would we also say that Susie is responding to all of these things, that there is a Susie who is in the midst of these circumstances and this body? Nature and nurture is one way that has often been used to describe an understanding of how mental health problems develop. Currently, we're in a phase where mental health professionals and the mental health world is very much preoccupied with nature. And biopsychiatry dominates our thinking and our practice of mental health care in the West at the moment. Our genes and our biology have got the predominant attention, and therefore psychoactive medication is the predominant mode of intervention. So in this diagram, I've made the body huge to emphasise that emphasis on nature. It hasn't always been thus. When I entered into psychiatry in the late 80s, we were just on a sort of hinge point. Biopsychiatry really began to sort of kick in and gain momentum as we moved into the 90s. But in a prior era, we were much more interested in circumstances. Social conditions, family dynamics were much more in the frame in our thinking about the generation of mental health problems. We used to talk about schizophrenic families, particular patterns of double binds within families that were understood to be precipitant of psychotic disorders, or famous studies of women who are depressed, noting a number of risk factors that were all environmental. Death of a mother before the age of 12, multiple children under the age of 5, social isolation, and so on and so on. Noticing both circumstances of the present and past, and the emphasis on nurture. So in other words, an awareness that our circumstances can affect us, and our body can affect us. But this emphasis on nature and nurture is intriguing, isn't it? Because if you stop and think about it for a little bit, you begin to realise that there is a strange omission of the heart. There is surprisingly little emphasis on the person who is doing the responding to their circumstances. The person who is, in some sense, responding even to what's going on in their bodies. The social sciences almost seem to lose sight of the person as a moral agent. But of course, two individuals faced with the same set of circumstances respond in two very different ways. Because we are unique individuals, we are moral agents, we do make choices. And we are not simply the product, we are not determined either by our biology, and we aren't determined by our circumstances. The Bible knows that we are moral agents, people who make choices. We're always responding to what happens. So all three matter. Heart, body, and circumstances, they all have a part to play. And as we think about somebody struggling, I want to be thinking about all three of these. And do you see that I also don't need to know the relative contribution? I don't need to be able to say, in this particular person who's depressed, it is 50% body, 20% circumstances, and 30% heart. I don't need to know that in order to know that all are significant, and also to know that God is most particularly concerned about our hearts. Because it's with our hearts that we worship. It's with our hearts that we do relationship with Him and with other people. So I will always want to have a particular interest and desire to intervene and to help and to support and to love at the level of the heart. But the model enables me to engage with all three. Does this model make sense to you? Is my question at this point. Does it help us to answer this question? I said this very unfair kind of stark alternative to you earlier on. But does this diagram and this model help us to answer this question in a more nuanced and helpful way without being forced into one of these extremes and shutting off the other, as it were? See, if I believe that your problem, the reason you're depressed, is because you lack faith, and you sort yourself out and believe a bit more, well, that's not terribly good for your mood, is it? Let's be honest. On the other hand, if I say, this is just a problem with your neurochemistry, so just take these SSRIs and wait. That's not terribly good for your sense of agency, is it? Either of those extremes has their problem. But the model that I'm trying to put in front of you enables us to say it can be both and, not either or. And I know that sounds terribly simple, but I do think that we've lost sight of that in the way in which we are engaging with and talking about mental health struggles. So far, I have wanted to suggest to you that there is a connection. This is legitimate territory for us, and to explore a model with you, and now find just some thoughts about engaging a crisis. We hear lots in the media about the idea of a mental health crisis at the moment. Is it real? And you can argue some statistics. One of the most commonly kind of quoted surveys is one from a while ago, 2014, a health survey. The charity Mind uses those figures, and they describe 1 in 4 people experiencing a mental health problem each year. Now, I think that raises all sorts of questions about whether this is sort of normalising. I mean, if 1 in 4 of us, then this begins to sound a little bit more like, well, this is your life. I recognise that the issues that I was mentioning earlier on about the medicalisation of life kick in at this point. But nevertheless, these are the statistics that are being used. 1 in 6 common mental health problem in any given week. And these things have worsened during the pandemic. So here is a survey from the Office of National Statistics detailing self-report of moderate to severe depression. And the green is pre-pandemic and the blue is post and during the pandemic. And those figures have remained high. Almost doubling during the pandemic. Or take another measure, the use of antidepressants. You see the statistics here of the climbing use of antidepressants over the last 30 years. Vast increases that you'll see there. Almost a doubling in the last 10 years. So that currently 16% of adults in the UK receive a prescription once per year. That's 1 in 6 of the UK population. And it's not as though it's working. We're not seeing huge decline in the level of depression in our society at the moment. Quite the reverse. So please understand, it's not simple. I mean, there was a stage where we discovered antibiotics and we started using antibiotics and infections really did go down. We're not seeing the same simple connection here, but because we've now discovered some antidepressants and we're giving antidepressants, depression is disappearing. It's not the reverse. One of the groups most sort of hit by our current mental health crisis are young people. Here is a graph showing referrals of children and young people to mental health services. And again, you see a dramatic increase. The red line on this graph is the point at which the pandemic begins. And you'll see a very significant climb in that period. It has been most dramatic in the area of eating disorders. This graph shows that change with the onset of the pandemic. I spoke to one friend who works in a unit dealing with young people presenting with eating disorders. She told me that in a normal year they might have about 100 to 150 referrals of young people with an eating disorder in 12 months during the midst of the pandemic, and that had climbed to 850. These are dramatic changes. What does this mean? I try to think about it in this kind of way. If we think about that triangle on the screen as representing everyone with a mental health problem, and broad at the base because there are more milder, and narrow at the top because there are less people with the most severe kind of struggles, well, you will understand that there is a limited amount of specialist input. There are only so many mental health professionals to go around. And so there is a threshold that you need to reach in order to access that tertiary care and get specialist input. It doesn't take much thinking to realise that if the overall number of people who are struggling with mental health problems has increased like this, then the amount of help available has not increased proportionately. We've still got the same basic level, and we can still slice off the top part of this pyramid, which therefore means that those who are not getting specialist input, the part of the pyramid under the threshold, has vastly increased. And not only is there a greater number, but the severity of those who are not accessing specialist input has increased as well. I spoke to a friend who works as a liaison psychiatrist, and she would be seeing people on the front line, people referred from hospital or from A&E, and she said that she had never known anything like the current situation, where she would be seeking to try and refer somebody who had developed a new onset of symptoms of psychosis with a likely diagnosis of schizophrenia, and she was being asked if she could request that this was managed in the community rather than being a referral through to a psychiatrist in specialist services. She said in all of her career she's been working in psychiatry for many decades. She'd never known a time like this. What does it mean? Well, it means a lot of people are struggling without care and input. What does that mean? It means that the church has got a great opportunity. The mental health services know that they desperately need community resources to step into some of the void that's being left. And we have an opportunity as the church to care for people. We have a responsibility to care for people in our congregations, because there will be people in our churches who are struggling, who are unable to get specialist input. And there'll be people around us in our communities. As I said at the beginning, I'm not sure that we do this very well. I'm not sure that this has been traditionally a strong suit for our churches. And I'd include a church that I have pastored in that. And I'd be fascinated to know if you agree with me, what you think gets in the way. Because I mean, it's sat here, we can all say, obviously, it's a lovely thing for the church to do. Yes, we really approve of that. It's great for the church. Step in, care for people well with these kind of struggles. But if you agree with me that actually we struggle to do that well, what prevents us? What barriers get in the way? Take 3 minutes in your groups, either online or in a room, and see what you pick out as your top 3 barriers to churches caring for people with mental health problems. What would be your top 3 barriers? Okay, two executive decisions. First is that I'm just going to list very quickly ones that have occurred to me. If you thought of other ones, I'd love to hear them. But then I'm also making an executive decision where I'm going to steal 5 minutes of your coffee break. If you've read something about that, just walk out. Okay, so I think there are a number of factors involved here, and the ones that I pick out would be the conceptual issue, that this somehow isn't our business, and it doesn't belong to us, and that's sort of dividing into sort of spiritual and psychological. And that's why I spent a long time at the beginning sort of challenging that idea. I think that the whole notion of that the Bible doesn't seem to say anything about these kind of conditions. And again, that's why I wanted to spend a bit of time picking at that. I think also people feel de-skilled and untrained, that this feels like a specialist area that we ought to leave to experts, and that frightens people off. I think the other fear is the fear of doing harm. I'm going to say the wrong thing, I'm going to do some damage, and that causes people to want to retreat. I think there's also a sense of, if I step into this realm, it's going to be too much for me. It's going to demand too much of my time. I think there's also a stigma issue. I think stigma has decreased in relation to mental health problems, but I don't think it's gone away. I think there's also an issue around confidentiality and privacy. It is. I remember a time at a prayer meeting where we had two people in our church family, both of whom were at imminent risk of death. One with acute pancreatitis and the other with an eating disorder. It was much easier and clearer that I was able to communicate to the church family about one than the other. And it really struck me very forcibly. And I don't think there are easy answers to that. And it creates difficulties for us. So I've just named them rather than offered any solutions to them. I think there are solutions to them. And many of those solutions are some of the things we're going to think about after the break. But let me stop at that point. And if you haven't got any questions, then we can turn on the break on time. If lots of questions, we might take an extra 5 minutes or so. So over to you. Things that you've occurred to you as we've been going along. We'll start in the room, and I think in a marvellously clever way. If you're online, you're able to throw in some questions as well. So anything, it doesn't need to be a question, it could be a comment or observation. Many here will have experience that we get to hear about.
Will I dive in?
Yes.
Or take the prompting. Cross-cultural differences in understanding and responding to mental health crises. Do you have any suggestions of resources and things involved?
No resources pop into my head. Helen says she's thought of any either. So I'm going to sort of an immediate resource to direct you to. I'm guessing any of the big mental health charities would almost certainly have something in that area, whether mind or indeed more conscious psychiatrists would have things. The expression of mental health struggles does vary hugely from culture to culture, and indeed has differed hugely over Spanish history as well. So the way in which our culture shapes how we present is considerable.
So we have one room. Yeah, sure.
I've got a friend who's a student services counsellor and a Christian, and he says, I find I have very few friends in the counselling world because they are suspicious because I'm a Christian. And I have very few friends in the Christian world because they're suspicious because I'm a counsellor. What is your experience of speaking like this to unbelieving psychiatric and counselling world? How have they received your establishing connections?
End of the question. Lots will be said. Let me try and be brief. I think that, for sure, if you think about my sort of annoying, awkward sort of alternative is biology or this sort of spiritual issues, where the church has gone very much in this direction of sort of repentance and faith and so on, I think rightly the mental health world would say that feels like a pretty clumsy and potentially damaging approach to take. I think it would be right to do so. So if we can arrive at a sort of a more nuanced sort of approach, I think that's well received. And when I have been speaking in conversation with people who work in the mental health world, I don't think the things that I'm saying are particularly contentious. I think lots of psychiatrists would recognise the many influences. I will ask you a question. To say a question again.
How have you been received when you presented the possibility of there being a spiritual nuance to the whole conversation?
Yeah, there was something else you said that I was going to answer.
Churches are suspicious of people being cancelled.
Oh, yeah, and I think the other thing I would say is that because of the explosion of struggle in this area, and it is particularly young people. I mean, I spoke at a big Christian conference with lots of people there, and everyone was surprised how many people wanted to come. And the thing that really struck me was that it was the younger end of the age spectrum who are thinking about these things and struggling with these things much more. And I think the mental health world knows that the community's got to step up. This is not something that can be managed.
But they don't want a Christian answer. They want a community help, but they don't want you to point to Jesus.
Yeah, and if we can find ways that demonstrate that we are able to do both of those, I think we'll find a way forward.
Got several questions online. First one is do you feel there's a move away from antidepressants now with natural methods like walking, time outside, stress relieving activities?
I don't see anything in the statistics that would suggest that yet. I would love it to be true. I don't see anything that demonstrates that it is yet. The reality, I think, is that if you are a GP and you have got your tiny number of minutes, it's really hard not to find that this is your route.
I'm going to be very naughty and ask the question myself. So the analogy between antibiotics and antidepressants gets a bit tricky because hopefully an antibiotic you stop it because you're better, and an antidepressant you might stay on it to stay well. But you triangle that the amount of psychotic illness has massively increased. What's that about?
No, I wasn't. No, the triangle is just
Everything.
everything. I wasn't picking up any particular form of mental health struggle within that. That would be anything. But the nice guidelines, National Institute for Clinical Excellence would have antidepressants being withdrawn after 6 months, assuming improved symptoms. But in reality, I think we are increasingly aware of withdrawal syndromes and people being on these medications for a very long time.
I'll ask one more from online. Is there a Christian response, or do you respond as a Christian in a particular context? I guess that may be a comment on the title we chose for this.
Well, I mean, I think this is a Christian response because we're doing it today. So this is our Christian response today. I think there are all sorts of ways in which we can and should be responding. That vary hugely from context to context, church to church. Sure.
We're having a little chat about the social side of disruption, which was both emotional and but also physical during the pandemic. And in theory, that's now being restored, whereas maybe disruption of the relationship with God hasn't changed that much from before the pandemic for people. But now the social side of things theoretically has come back, and you've not seen any real improvement in mental health. Do you have any ideas why?
I think that though I showed you slides showing some distinct shifts pre and post-pandemic, I don't want to overplay that. The rise in prevalence of mental health struggles is a long-standing trend. The way predates the pandemic. If you wanted me to pontificate about some of the things that might lie behind that trend, I mean, I could, though it is my sort of personal speculations. But I think there was an intensification of the pandemic, but it's a much broader thing that's going
on. There will be more time for Q&A later. I'll bring one more question from online. How can the church help to ease the shame surrounding mental illness, since that sense of shame can be exacerbated in a religious environment or community?
Yeah, I think we'll be doing a fair bit of that after. Probably let me just say one thing at the moment. Okay, one thing I sometimes get people to think about is the statement, with my mental health struggles, my non-Christian friends were much more helped to me than my Christian friends. Why is that? Whenever I use that as a discussion starter, generally I find people in the room saying, yes, I've heard that, or I've heard something similar to that. Why is that? I think it's because we don't really believe the gospel. I don't think we really believe that we are all needy people who struggle. And we love to pretend that we're fine. We love to pretend that our churches are fine. We love to present ourselves as jolly marvellous and sorted. And we quite like churches where everybody's sorted. And we quite like churches that are very efficient and very neat and tidy. And all of that, I think, contributes. And we think we've got a solution. So somebody goes to their non-Christian friend and talks about their misery and their depression, and their non-Christian friend knows that they haven't got any solution, so they listen to them. There is a tendency for us thinking, well, we've got Jesus. And so we sort of, we move into solution mode, clumsily, prematurely, simplistically, and I think that's all contributes to a sense of shame. Please stop.
Thank you very much, Steve. We forgive you for taking 5 minutes of a coffee break. It's fantastic conversation. Sorry to head to nothing during the last question in the room. And we now have